Hi, and welcome to the Practitioner Podcast. This is a podcast from us at Renaissance. We're a network of missional practitioners and microchurches in the greater Boston area. Every episode, we're going to talk about themes around living on mission and living in microchurch communities. So our hope is that these conversations are practical, touching on the realities of everyday, ordinary people just like us. This is because our mission is about cultivating beautiful kingdom people embedded in the everyday stuff of life. And today, my name is Christine. It's that everyday, actually. And I'm here with the one and only...
Drew Thurman.
Hello, hello. How are you doing? How are you holding up in the summer heat finally coming in?
I'm excited, though I did just see, I think I sent it to you. It's the windiest year on record. Apparently we live in Scotland. We didn't know.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like I'm excited, but now it's time for me to complain about how muggy it is. So
you and my wife Brianna, she has like a 2-degree window that she's happy in. So we're about to in 10 minutes cross that threshold into her being miserable.
It's called having a point of view, okay? Okay, well, today I thought before we kind of get into our whole conversation, I think our fun thing we could talk about is, you and I have both been in microchurches for a while, and I thought we should share out something we've done that has been weirder than we anticipated. And I can start since I had the question. And this actually happened last weekend. So our microchurch has been trying to be intentional about incorporating the kids in our microchurch better. And our normal format, we, have a meal all together, we do communion all together, but since our kids are a little bit younger in our microchurch, we usually send them somewhere else and they watch a show while we do discussion or whatever. But someone in our microchurch had a good idea of, can we make sure we incorporate them in our full weekly gathering, especially the 40 days after Easter, and that's kind of transformed into our full summer plan. And so last week we had the idea that we were going to do an interactive scavenger hunt to teach a Bible story. So we broke down the story of Moses, and it was kind of like this whole thing where the kids had to find these scrolls that had a phrase that had to do with something in the scripture, and then they had to find the right adult to scream the phrase at, and then they got to hear a part of the story, and then they get a prop, right? And one of the stations was about Passover, and so this isn't going to be, I don't know.
Did you try to kill the firstborn?
Yeah, I did. I tried to murder one of the kids. I'm just kidding. No children were harmed in the making of this activity. But the station was like, you got a paintbrush with red paint, and then we ended up swiping on one of the kids' foreheads, and they thought it was really fun and funny. But the family that hosted, one of their neighbor's kids had come over and done the activity with them, which was great. But then when the scavenger hunt was over, their neighbor's kid's dad came to pick them up, and one of the kids in our microchurch thought, this is really fun and cool. I think everybody should have a swipe of red paint across their forehead. And so then she swipes it across all of our foreheads. We all look kind of crazy. And then we were doing this nice little activity where we were going to tell all the dads in our group, because it was Father's Day, what we love and respect about their parenting. And then this neighbor's kid's dad comes over, and one of the members of our microchurch was like, oh, we should tell him. And first of all, he's looking at a group of adults with 4 kids with red paint smeared across their forehead. That is already weird enough.
It's kind of weird.
Yeah, it's very weird. And then, one of the members of our microchurch was like, oh, we should include him too and tell him something we appreciate, because he's been around a little bit.
Yeah.
And then the kid that had swiped everybody's head with foreheads, I don't think he's a part of the group because he's not pretending to be an Israelite. And we're just like, oh,
this is awkward.
Oh, okay. Good. Great. This is awesome. So that was a very funny moment. I mean, I don't regret doing the scavenger hunt. Maybe a little bit less cultish ending would be my choice, but
I was gonna ask, yeah, that I think I would have been in cold sweats, oh my gosh, this is so weird. So I mean, yeah, we've done some stuff with kids too, that if anyone would have walked in, we did Palm Sunday a couple of years ago where the kids took turns being, one was the donkey and one would be with Jesus, and we all had palms, and it was really fun. But if anyone walked in, they would have been like, "That was kind of weird." But no, it's a little less like crazy than that. But I think through like our early days when we would host people at Jason Katie's house, there's more folks that would circle through, and part of our liturgy, like a lot of it was pretty easy. Like we're eating dinner, we're talking about our weeks. Even I think most people like step in and like, okay, like I don't know a lot about the Bible, but I'm okay like interacting with it and like, I think a lot of people view it as like a moral text primarily.
Yeah.
But we would always practice listening prayer. And like you realize like this is really awkward and weird for people. Like when people like don't feel comfortable in our culture anyways in silence, but then to like, wait, like you're all like hoping God will speak to you. And like, this feels really weird and I don't know what to do with this. It was, so I think that was one of the weirder, like definitely not a, like everybody from the neighborhood, like this is going to be the thing that's going to have you come and hang out in our living room. Like come sit as we do listening
practices.
Yeah. As we do listening prayer together, like, okay, that's kind of weird. So, but it was awesome, beautiful, but definitely strange for some.
Yeah, I love that. I think this is a good segue because we're going to go back and forth each episode on who's bringing the theme, and sometimes we're also hoping to bring in some guests, just a little nice preview. But today, Drew, you're going to bring our theme. So what are we going to be chatting about for the rest of this conversation?
Yeah, I'm excited right now, by the way. This is the longest I've now lived anywhere. So we're just crossed over the 7-year mark. I'm entering year 8 at this work. And so there's some things, and that's where a lot of this podcast has come out of. There's some things you start to learn along the way that you realize that are pretty common refrains that are happening. And so that's why the theme today and this topic is why Microchurch is not a church growth strategy, which sounds like a great hook. I'm sure it's going to look great in the as it comes through on Apple Podcast or YouTube.
Yeah,
we're going to get in. There's
strategy.
Exactly. The antithesis of what we're actually trying to do with this podcast in this episode, hilariously, but there's some nuance to what we're talking about that. But I've chosen this because I think not everyone's church experience is universal. And I know there's more nuance, but primarily what I've seen from either people that are coming from church spaces or don't have a lot of church experience, but what they've experienced from the church comes from kind of a church growth attractional mindset. And that is really hard to realize some of the tentacles of what that does in our thinking, and the assumptions that we bring into a community or our work in Microchurch. And so I think it's one of those things we just need to name and wrestle through if this work is going to be the kind of good news that we hope it will be.
Yeah, I love that. So let's kind of start with the basics. There's probably some decoding that we need to do here because, like you said, not everybody comes from the same church background, upbringings, experiences. And so maybe we can just start with, can you tell us, like, what is church growth? And then why do you think it's baked in so many church contexts in our culture? And I think the final question that I want us to start with is, like, how does this manifest for the average American Christian?
No, those are all great questions, and we could obviously spend an entire episode just on that question. So I'll try to make this really quick. And we obviously touched on a few of these ideas in the previous episode talking about leadership. But yeah, I think what's interesting is I think for most people, they just imagine that church growth is like all there has ever been. And the reality is that it was the church growth, what we would call movement, really emerged in the evangelical space in the late 20th century. There's a lot of, like, if you study it, names that I'm not going to spend any time with, but like Donald McGavern, Robert Schuller, Rick Warren, Bill Hybels. You're going to read some of these names, and the thinking was, I think, probably pure in a lot of ways. You had people that really wanted to see God's kingdom grow and deeply desired people to experience Jesus. But what that kind of became known for was really, using the church and its programs and what was happening inside the building as the driver of that through attraction is kind of the word that gets used. So how do we, through the kind of preaching that we have, the kind of worship that we, and music styles that we use, the kind of programming we have primarily for kids, now we obviously see a lot of churches to the point that they are almost like shopping malls, and then all the, things that they can offer in the lobby, even if you come in on a Sunday morning. How do we attract people to come and participate in this so that we can obviously give them the message of who Jesus is? And with that, one of probably the unintended consequences is that there has been an increasing for the last 30, 40 years of viewing all of God's work through numbers and through numerical growth. We kid around, if you've ever operated one of these churches, that the driving forces are very institutional, and that what most folks are thinking and what they want to celebrate we call the 4 B's. So it's buildings, budgets, butts and seats, and baptisms. And so that's how we view God's work. That's how we view success. That drives all the decisions that we make. And that doesn't, that has become so pervasive. That's not just in large, what we would call mega churches that are a couple thousand or bigger. Almost most evangelical and Protestant churches these days operate with a lot of attractional principles in one way or another. How do we get people inside our buildings, inside of our programs? That's why, even when we do stuff in community, you'll hear the word outreach. This is only for us to have a quick exposure to our community, let them know we exist, and then invite them to what we do on our turf. And so, I think we're going to talk about this more when it comes to microchurch and why I think it's really destructive when we step in with that same kind of framework. But I think what this manifests for the average Christian is, because a lot of this, again, I didn't even really mention, but obviously comes borrowing a lot of business principles and a lot of corporate thinking. But if you already live in that world, you already live in a capitalistic culture where my job and everything else I do is all about growth in all areas. We need to make more money. We need to be more efficient. We need to have more people, consuming whatever we do. When we bring that into religious context, and when we bring that into the church, there's all kinds of and we could tell stories forever. And I think that's what a lot of people are some people are fleeing and deconstructing right now in our current cultural moment, among many other things that come from some of the institutionalized expressions of church that we've seen. But I still think that there's hardwired in so many of us that if something's valuable in religious spaces, there has to be numerical success always attached to it. And so and I even I've been at this conversation now, like I said, I'm going into my 8th year of living this out practically. And I still find myself sometimes defaulting to my only way of viewing success or God's favor or God's work in the world is that there's growth numerically, there's more money in the bank account, there's more people coming to Jesus that we and I've reduced the expansive nature of who God is to this very small metrical box. And I think there's still a lot of Christians that's been so hardwired in them that whether it's their marriage or their Bible study time or the way they treat their kids or the way they interact in any other part of their faith and any community that they're a part of, they have no imagination for that there's seasonality, that there's times where things are going well, times that are not going well, times where God calls us into weakness, times where God calls us into silence, God calls us into struggle. There's none of that. And so it manifests if God's in it, there should be up and to the right, the best is yet to come. You see that phrase being thrown around a lot. And I think that's so long-winded answer, but I think that's kind of how it ends up playing out for a lot of believers.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I grew up in the seeker-sensitive movement, right, where we want to orient our practices around, I think you use this phrase, the lowest common denominator. And And also just this idea, I mean, a phrase that came up a lot in the spaces I worked in, and it's just like healthy things grow. And I
Mm,
think there's a lot in that, I mean, I get the premise, but I
yeah.
think the longer I was in it, a thought that came to mind is like, you know what else grows? Like cancer, tumors,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, like it,
Weeds.
right. Yeah. Like there's just so much that I do, but I think that even when I think about how long it took me to come into that space of like, wait, I don't think this phrase actually makes sense, is indicative of how embedded that idea that like health means expansion. Health means getting bigger. And we don't think about there are things that are not scalable. And I remember when I was in my spiritual formation undergrad program, my professor, Dr. Neil Wyndham, who we've talked about on the podcast before, I think, he talked about how discipleship can't be mass produced.
Mm,
And I remember then I started my first year of ministry, which was in a mega church, and that phrase like stuck with me so much of like, well, then what am I doing?
mm,
You
yeah.
know, but then I think the cognitive dissonance, you have to just be like, no, it's just fine, like this is good.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and I think it's just easy to get into that space where we are not totally honest with ourselves about what's actually happening, and we think if we have more people, if there are these metrics that we can point to, that means God's in it.
Yep.
And I think I know you and I, Drew, have talked about this before, and just like our personal wrestlings with our time in ministry, that there are so many moments where, because there was lots of quantity, it was easy to be like, God's in this. But yet, I think deep down, I know like the 500 steps I took behind the scenes to make this moment happen,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know? And
Huh.
I think reflecting on that, it's not that God can't use that stuff. He sure
Mm,
can. He can do whatever
yeah.
he wants. But I think there is a level of bravado, arrogance in myself. I see that. Just
Yeah.
assuming that these things that I proliferated through my skills and like strategies, that I can really dial down to exactly how we got this many people in the room, how we made this moment feel like
Mm,
this, right? That's God. And I think that's the rub too, is like I like what you said about boxing God into this like metric limitation, when God can work in that stuff, but God is also working way beyond that, and in ways we can't see, in ways we can't feel. And we are
absolutely.
not as attuned to that when we're so focused on making these moments or metrics happen. But I wonder too, like,
Well, real quickly, I want to pick up on because I think I want to just circle back. I love everything that you're saying, and I 100%. I mean, we could spend episodes just on that last 2 minutes, 3 minutes of
yeah,
what you're saying. But yeah, I think going back to the lowest common denominator. I mean, I think that's even part of. I mean, part of the problem. There's a reason why I think we don't end up gravitating towards the poor or the marginalized or the people who are struggling or who don't have an affinity for religious goods and services and darkening the door of a church building. Not that there are some, and that's wonderful,
yeah,
but we end up reducing like that we have no time for them. There's an efficiency that is needed
yeah.
to
That's a really
achieve
good point.
the ends that we're trying to get at. And so I really appreciate you just talking, like, using that phrase, because I think, again, lots of other problems as well. But I think that's a huge one that we should just own. And the reality is less and less of our culture is interested. We know statistically in some of the spaces that we've designed. And so, I think at some point we have to realize both spiritually, walking in the way of Jesus, but just even practically,
Yeah.
we have missed the mark.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because I mean, a lot of times when people are in vulnerable spaces or have high needs, it's hard. That's not attractive, right?
No.
Because that's intrinsically inviting other people, if you want to get involved, into really difficult, slow, usually long-term work. And that's
Yeah.
not efficient for boosting your numbers, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
then I think that's also why there's I think a lot of these spaces become really monolithic in many ways, right? Because it's like we just want things, people that look like us, act like us, feel like us, and that is easy to multiply and make bigger. You just find other people that are like you.
Yep.
But I always love, like, when we are talking about diversity in our context and something that we care about and are passionate about and have a lot of room to grow in, like, I think we talk about, like, diversity for diversity's sake isn't the point. It's about being a foretaste of heaven, right? And in the midst of that, like, that takes hard, slow work, and is intrinsically going to be difficult and messy, and it's not efficient.
Absolutely.
But I think, we're talking about the places we've been in before and now places that we're not in. And so let's bring this back to us. Like, how does this apply to our work in microchurch spaces? And I guess, like, as you brought the topic today, Drew, why did you feel like it was important to clarify this sort of topic?
Yeah, well, I think that what I've experienced is there's so many folks that step into this conversation, and I think we have to own. I mean, there's probably, like, for some of us, our parents or grandparents can imagine a time when the church growth movement, attractional church, was not so pervasive that they can probably imagine another expression of church. But for a whole generation of us under a certain age, this is the predominant, most visible form of faith in our culture. And so we would be silly to think that that doesn't have an impact on how we think about communal faith, and how we imagine ourselves in faith-based spaces. And so I've seen people from both sides of the coin, kind of on two extremes. I mean, everybody's on a spectrum probably on this conversation, but there's some that come in very cynical, or very wounded to some of our work. And when they still hear us, we're not opposed to growth. We're not opposed to God bringing renewal. In fact, I mean, we talk a lot about that we really want to see God's kingdom rule and reign, like, manifest in 4 different places, that we want to see him reconcile us to him, reconcile us to ourselves, reconcile us to others, to mankind, and reconcile us to creation. We think God, and we believe that God brings fully aliveness when we live the way he's designed us to live in that restoration.
Right.
We start to live the way that we're supposed to. We're for that way, and we are on a mission to co-create that in the world with God, that his presence would be known in all in all. But I think there's some people that they still view that through kind of an institutional church growth, like grow at all cost. I don't matter. I maybe got wounded by the church, or I got hurt. I had a problem, or I didn't fit in the exact, movement of this entity. I got washed up on the other side of it, and now I'm kind of transposing that on top of this new expression of faith that I'm talking about joining, because that's all I can imagine. It's hard for me to imagine a community that can be both for God's mission and isn't just sitting around and counting things and just trying to be efficient all the time. That's really hard. Yeah. And then on the flip side, you have people who maybe had a really great experience in those spaces and are, for one reason or another, have entered this conversation and are convinced that it's new and innovative. Maybe they're just early adopters that like to do things at the cutting edge, and they step into this space and think, this is the new silver bullet. This is the new thing. This is the new fast way to grow churches and make lots of disciples. And what ends up happening, I've seen from those folks, is they often also kind of transpose that on top of what we do, and they just start doing attractional church, but for their living room. And so it's like I'm not going to live on mission. I'm not going to embed myself in the rhythm and rituals of my neighborhood. I'm not going to have a long-term view. I'm thinking, how quickly can I get a bunch of people here in my living room to do life together? And then how can we start multiplying that? Right. And a lot of them end up really disappointed, obviously, because that we just know it doesn't typically work that way. So I think, and then, I mean, obviously there's lots of us in between, but I think those are the two extremes. And I feel like we end up doing so much explaining, and we're not trying to get away from ever having to explain anything. But I think it does really add to the process, because I think people step in and they just have no imagination for anything beyond what they've experienced in this very big, I guess it feels like you're swimming upstream. And it's like, I'm still a person of faith. I still believe in mission. I've not given that up, but
Right.
I'm not doing it the way that we're, kind of the currents flowing everywhere around me. And it's just hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because like I resonate with that. I remember when our microchurch I'm a part of, first started in Manchester. I was talking with my dad, who is like an evangelical pastor, and he's like, "Oh, you're like starting a church in your house," and he's like, "What are you doing for outreach? Like, are you gonna?" He's like, "You should have your mom like cook a really nice meal and then like invite people over for that to get them to come."
Your mom, if there's someone who could attract, I think it's your mom's
I
cooking.
mean, yeah, 1000%. But I was like, I'm gonna have to turn this down. Like, thanks, but no thanks. And I guess maybe what I also want to surface though, like that's less a story about like, oh, like I did it right. But I think I'm interested in your perspective on this, because I think in that moment when it was clear to me that is not the way to do it. And yet the longer I'm in this, there is a sense of, I feel this tension growing up in the evangelical space where I'm always feeling guilty that I'm not evangelizing enough, I'm not presenting the gospel enough. And there is that part of me that's like, I do believe this is good news. Like, I love Jesus. I think he's so compelling. I think the way that when we live to follow him, it leads to a full and abundant life. And yet I feel this tension a lot where I don't want to go in to these relationships that I'm forming and into my life with like an agenda, because I think that's how it felt a lot in the church growth space. It's like we meet people who are not believers so that we can get them to come to Jesus and get them to come to church, and it's like that feels gross to me now. And I also have this other side where I'm like, no, but I actually do believe this is good news, so I have to do something with that, right? And I think that's the tension I live in now, where a couple years down the road, I have no desire to attract people into this space, and yet I'm like, I do believe in this, and so I think it's important. I don't know. Have you ever felt that?
Oh, I mean, I think I was just talking about that at our last celebration in my breakout group, like that the temptation is camouflage for sure. And for me, I would actually say for me personally, it's less of a rejection of church growth mentality. It's a lot of times just I'm not sure what I'm trying to talk about is good news to our culture. And I don't want to lose the risk involved of losing relationships or friendships feels too high sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think for a lot of us, I think we probably, and I think that's a part of this for sure, that we have to, realize that we, like once we've built relationships and we have equity, that we should feel comfortable at that point starting to, again, it's not that we're opposed to growth or talking about our faith. It's just, we're not reducing ourselves to inviters to a program or to a thing, that we own, that everyone's on a different, we respect everyone's spiritual journey, that everybody's on like a different, course and on a different path and on a different timeline and a trajectory. And it's not the right invitation and the right presentation that's going to solve all that all the time. That sometimes it's just going to be, again, that's why I think some people are disappointed. It's living on mission. It's just taking a much longer term, like I'm going to build relationships. We call this very pragmatically incarnational ministry. This is what Jesus did.
Right.
And I always chuckle, and no one never brings this up, that Jesus didn't do anything till he was age 30. And, John 1:14 tells us, and I really love the Message translation, that Jesus took on flesh and bone and moved into the neighborhood. He became one of us. He drew near to us. He learned our struggles. He learned our need. And he waited a very long time before his public announcement of what his kingdom really was. And what, and I think sometimes we've been so baked and hardwired, like you're saying, into this, because it's very easy to weaponize evangelism when you need church growth for metrics, that we've been told and guilted that if you're not like on some timeline, that you're somehow missing the boat. And it's like, no, like, I know my friends. I know the timeline they're on. And I'm not going to
Yeah.
feel bad about taking my time. Jesus did. And
Yep.
even his public ministry was 3 years, and took him 3 years really for his disciples to figure out, and they spent every day with him, what in the world was going on. So why am I in such a rush in like 4 months, or like I just met this neighbor and in 3 conversations I've got to work in something to get them to my microchurch? Like, I think at that point I should maybe probe the depths of why I'm feeling some of that anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other part, as you're sharing about that makes me think is one thing that's been really grounding for me in this journey is truly centering myself on God's agency in the world. In
So
that,
I was hoping we were going to get there.
I think for me, that's been a game changer because there are a couple people in my life that are not Christians. I just feel like God is working deeply in their lives, and I don't think the end goal is for them to become a part of my microchurch. I think Jesus wants to win them to himself, but I actually don't think my role is like, I got to make sure I present the gospel to you and make sure you come to my microchurch at all. I actually don't think that's on the table at all. But that doesn't mean God's not working, and that doesn't mean God doesn't have a role for me to play in their lives in a redemptive way.
Yeah.
And I feel like for me, that's been very grounding. And a couple years into this journey, I realized how counterintuitive it is to the way I was raised in the evangelical space, where if you meet someone who's not a Christian, it is absolutely your job to convert them,
Yep.
and you got to take them from A to Z. And it's been so helpful to think of God's grand narrative and beautiful story he's writing across time, nations, places, and in across my life. And that there are different roles for me to play in different spaces with different people. And I can rest in that and not be so anxious, like every person I meet, I gotta make sure,
Yep. Well, and we talk a little bit about this. I mean, this is obviously tangential to this conversation, but we talk about this in our cohort. We use some of Michael Frost's work that, really the New Testament tells us that there's some people that are gifted at evangelism, and I've been with those people. I'm not one of them. Who they show up, like I've been in a pub with them, and somehow it doesn't feel gross when they're having this very awesome spiritual conversation with the people, people are around them, and no one seems to be taken back by it, and it feels very natural and organic, and it's just because it's their gift. And then there's some of us, like, we try to do that and we just make fools of ourselves. And so I think there's something to be said when Paul talks about us just being ready to have an answer for the good news that we have. Like when God's agency does present itself, that we would be ready to talk about our faith, and that have the kind of spirituality and faith that I actually can name what it is that is good news. What it is that God is actually transforming and doing in my life. Like I can name that. That's really, I think God's going to make those opportunities presented to themselves eventually if we build equity with people. But there's some of us that are just gifted to do this, to do that work. And others of us that we're not all evangelists. We're not. We're just, and we need to be okay with that. And I think the church, for its own institutional gain, has hardwired us to believe that we are. And, I think has, again, conflated God's mission in the world with numerical growth all the time, which really brings this to what I really would like to ask you. So basically what we're talking about is that growth is not the problem. It's not that we think that we never want to grow or we don't want to experience fullness in God. That's not what we're getting at all. But certain outworkings of it are very unhelpful. So from your perspective and what you've been learning and kind of what you can think about us from across Renaissance, but how should we evaluate growth and movement in our microchurches? That we should be able to look and say, like, this is something, all of us at some point need to evaluate. Is this worth my time? Is this valuable? Is this life-giving? So what do you think about when you think about Manchester Project or when you think about any of our microchurches? How do you define that?
Yeah. I think if we're thinking about an easy way to label it, I do like going back to the 3 C's that we talk about, starting on our cohort of community, communion, and co-mission. Those are the things that are hopefully present if you are in a microchurch. And communion we define as worship, essentially, community, that like deep spiritual connections, family, sense of family, and fun. And then commission, that we're pursuing justice and serving our neighborhoods together in some way. And I think those are things that to me feel grounding. I do think, though, that something I love about our network is that we don't define growth as like, oh, like how many co-mission events did you do this, that, like it's more just about the stories that emerge and paying attention to the work of the Spirit. And I think why I like that we talk about growth more as stories is because stories are also not always linear, right? It's like there are times where you are at the beginning of the story, but that beginning chunk is actually a lot longer, and there's winding paths, and it's not finished, and I think that helps me navigate. I think when I think about our microchurch, I might have told this story on the podcast before, where we tried to do like a justice, like co-mission event that like Johanna and I like just tried to like put on for our microchurch, and like nobody was into it.
Yeah.
Like, it was just like, it wasn't like really emerging, I think, from a place of communal felt need, and it was just like, let's do something to do something, right? Like, and that's probably like out of my own anxiety and sense of like, we got to do stuff so we have something to show for ourselves. And I think now, I still think that our microchurch specifically has a lot of room to grow in what it looks like to live out co-mission together. But I also feel a sense of just lack of anxiety in striving. I think at least my personality and the way I've grown up in church, I have a deep propensity to feel like I need to strive and achieve and do enough things for God to be okay with me. And in our microchurch journey, I feel like, there's something really beautiful about the way that fostering kids. One of the families in our microchurch are foster parents, and that has become just something that we're all passionate about, care about, find ways to show up for. And it's different for each of us, but it's less about we did these 6 events or we fostered these X amount, and it's more just about like, it's getting embedded in us. It becomes a part of our lives. It becomes, and I feel like that's a little bit more intangible, which I think is what makes it hard, right? In this space, it's like, I really can't tell you, here's X, Y, and Z as to why I think that we are growing in this way. But I could tell you some stories, and I could tell you about, just like how deeply people, like, I think one of the like most beautiful stories to me was like when the foster kid in our microchurch got to be adopted. It was just like most of our microchurch went to Boston to like show up for that, right? And it's less about like, oh, like we're so awesome, but more just like we just care so much about this person, and this is an issue of justice, and it's complex, right? Like adoption is traumatic as well as it's a gift. And I think learning all of those things together to me feels like the journey we're on, rather than this like, oh, we put on this event, oh, we feel really good about ourselves, oh, we are like really justice minded. And I think that's the transformation for me. But what about you? Like when you think about like, how do we measure this stuff? How do we evaluate it? Like, what comes to mind for you?
I mean, I think you named it really well. I mean, we talk a lot about being fueled by stories, and, that is a driving principle. I mean, I borrowed it a lot from Brad Briscoe. I think I've seen others talk about it as well, but we hit on quantitative versus qualitative metrics. It's not that we don't ever count anything. I mean, it's, we obviously, it's not a big driving force for us. I know how many microchurches we have. I know how many people we've trained and sent out to be practitioners. That's wonderful. I don't think it tells the whole story, as we're saying. I think we were mentioning that earlier. Like, you can have lots of numbers and it not actually tell you anything. And as a business owner, I know that now. Like, numbers matter, but they don't tell the full story. And so I think, one of the things that we try to spend a lot of time doing is saying, how do we have more qualitative, story-based ways of celebrating success and tracking what God's doing, and, viewing, again, growth. I mean, even what you were getting at, I don't even think it's always before. We also, like, this is always my issue with just tracking conversions is it's an ongoing process. This idea that it's a before and after is just not true of our life story. And I think anyone who spends any time in any realm of life besides just like gathering Christians in a service, like if you spend time talking to people, if you spend time in your neighborhood, if you try to tackle a really complex issue of justice or people that are dealing with poverty or some social issue, you realize that everything's more complex and nuanced than you want it to be, that there's a lot of times that there's unintended consequences. And like I love what you're getting at, like telling the story through adoption. Everything is more complex. All of our stories, all of our lives, everything requires a level of complexity that we can't track with Excel spreadsheets. Mm-hmm. And so when that's all that we think about, we really miss the mark. And I think that's really what when we talk about getting people into microchurch, that's what we want for them, is that they would be placed into a relational setting that gathers around tables, that gathers around fire pits, that gathers around third space. And those stories have space that people can wrestle through all of who they are, both individually and then collectively as a community, and realize like there's an ongoing story here that can't always be tracked, but we can try our best to tell it and give and name it. And so I think that's that's how we view it. And there is, I think one of the things that sometimes we get really caught up in what's happened like in the last week or the last 6 months. But I think sometimes when we have the ability to like talk about our stories and from a bigger picture, we're able to realize like there is growth. God is doing something. I'm not the person that I was 5 years ago. I'm not the person that I was 10 years ago. And I'm thankful for that. Our community is not the community that it was 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And that's really good. And we can talk about like, what are some of the things that I'm sensing? What are some of the places that we're changing? And I think that just feels really life-giving. It's sometimes harder to know exactly, there's less probably like rah-rah moments, or like let's charge the hill type thinking. Yeah. But the nuance and the stories also provide just a level of beauty that I just don't think ever gets captured the other way. Yeah. And so I think for a lot of us, that's what we have to kind of rest our heads on.
Yeah. I also, that makes me think too, that what I love about being on this journey is that it gives so much more credence to struggle and growth. Mm-hmm. And I remember we did this training a few years ago about like spiritual formation and development, and how like doubt is actually a phase of spiritual maturity, that if you don't have a faith that ever doubts and like wrestles through hard questions, you're actually like stagnating, because you're probably like not using your mind fully in how you engage with God. And I think that for me it's like what you're talking about having more complexity in what we are evaluating as growth, that I know that I feel enlivened in our microchurch when people ask really hard, unanswerable questions, because I think you're drawing near to God. Like, you're asking this because you want to know more of God, like, and also believing that like God is working in that God will respond to that. I don't know how, I don't know when, but like He will. And I think there's a space for that in being on this journey of being a missional practitioner and being a part of microchurches that I have never felt before, because it felt like the minute you started asking questions or doubting and suffering and struggling, it was like, oh, like what's wrong with you? Like, this isn't the story you want to tell. Like,
yes, exactly.
This is going off the rails. And I think for me, it's become so much more expansive, that like what used to be like you're going off track, you're going off the rails, you're backsliding, whatever it is.
Well, there's an inefficiency to that, correct?
Right. Yeah, totally. And now it's just like, oh no, like I don't know what's happening here, but I think it's beautiful, and that God can meet you here, and maybe He wants me to be a part of meeting you here. I don't know, like, and that there's room for that. There's room for God truly being with us, in the blood and guts of our lives, in the suffering of our lives. And I think that's probably also why, in the evangelical spaces I grew up in, there was not a lot of room for lament.
Mm,
And I think about Open Table, like the digital micro community we're a part of with people who have experienced a lot of religious trauma and suffering. And it's always so interesting to me. That's probably one of the most like sacred spaces I've ever been a part of. And it is like, I don't know, you can push back on this, but I'm like, I feel like 80% of it is like lamenting.
no, that's
You
probably
know,
right.
it's just, it's sad, it's hard, and it's painful, and yet I think it's deeply beautiful, and I feel very certain that God is in the grief, and God is in the tears, and God is in the anger. And I feel like we've also seen that like that space, Open Table, where we were 2 or 3 years ago, is not where it was at all. But it's also like, I think meeting after meeting, we don't
Yeah.
get away from lamenting. It's never like, oh, this is the best. The best is yet to come. Like, there
Yeah.
is literally none of that energy. It's like people
No.
cry like every meeting. It's very
Mm.
sad every meeting. And yet it's been transformative. I know for myself. And I feel like I see that in the
Oh,
people who are
I feel
part
like
of it.
there's tons of growth in that
Yeah.
community. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you need a lot of time to hear the stories. Yeah,
Yeah.
doesn't track on a spreadsheet. But well, I
Yeah.
even think of like you got me to read a book recently called "Don't Forget We're Here Forever."
Oh, so good.
Reminder. What's her name again?
Lenorna Ash?
Yes, that's right. Is it Lamorna?
Lenorna or Lamorna? I don't know her
Well, one
first
of them.
name. It
Yeah,
begins with
one
an
of them.
L and her last name is Ash.
She's based out of the UK, but yeah, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with every conclusion she has in the book, but I think for me, going back to what you were describing, there is no way to read that book and her experience kind of as a journalist touring churches, starting very hostile, definitely to some of the types of faith that we were describing at the beginning of this podcast. That made her feel a little bit like she was on a conveyor belt, assembly line of faith, conversion. But there's no way to explain her own story in that book from start to finish without God's agency. And it's messy, and it's not linear. It doesn't color inside the lines, and it doesn't fit what lots of people would feel comfortable with. But there is no way to get to the end of that book, to the conclusion, and say that this is not someone who is being transformed and changed into the likeness of God, and who's experiencing transcendence, experiencing God's work in her heart and life. And I know so many people like that.
Yeah.
And it makes me frustrated that we reduce the faith journey for all of us in our participation in faith-based spaces on numerics. There's a complexity and that's what I love about the microchurch conversation when it's done right. And what I want when people enter it is like, if you're skeptical and coming into this conversation, I want you to know we are going to respect your story and your journey. Yes, I'm unapologetic. I want you to experience that goodness, and I want you to experience Jesus, but I'm never going to rush you there. And I will walk with you as long as it takes. And even if you don't ever end up crossing the line of things that I'm hoping or praying for, I'm still going to be right there.
Yeah.
Your autonomy, your story matters to me. I'm not trying to use you to just count or to tell your testimony someday. That's not my goal for your life. Two, if you're coming from this space and all you've done and all you can think about is, get stuff done, grow 10% in all areas all the time, I need to be up and to the right. There is like this beautiful spirituality to slowing down and just like experiencing people's stories and the complexity. And you start to find God in ways you never could experience him before. And so I think that's when when we really ground this conversation, like that's what I so deeply desire. Which brings me, like, we're kind of bringing this full circle, and I know we need to start moving towards wrapping it up. But
Yeah.
as you think about people who are entering this conversation, if they're interested in microchurch spaces, if it is more than a church growth strategy, what are you hoping? Like, what are your desires for what they should be hoping for, and what their mindset should be entering into it?
I think I don't know exactly how to put this into words, but I feel it in my body that I hope people meet Jesus again in ways that they weren't expecting. I think that's been a huge part of it for me, even I'm realizing something personal I'm going through lately is uh I've realized that there's a lot less emotionality in my faith
Mm,
in the last few years, and it's been like really interesting because I was talking with a friend who recently about it, and I realized like some ways I kind of miss that. Like I miss feeling
mm,
feelings about stuff and especially about my faith, and then there's a part of me that I is like very like I'm very content. Like my life is good. I feel like I sense God and he's working in my life. He's working in the lives of those around me. And but the conclusion I came to is I was like, I think part of this is like I feel triggered when I get into an emotional space about faith
mm,
because of my own religious trauma. And
mm,
I doubt like in the past, like was I being manipulated? What was going on? Was I just seeking an emotional high and not actually experiencing God? So it's almost like there's so much about my life that is no longer oriented in this space in that way.
mm,
And then when I get into this internal space, that's like the one part of me that I'm like, I don't know how to touch in myself without feeling unmoored. Um, but it was really interesting because like in a time of prayer, it was like a week and a half ago, I was just praying and journaling about this of just like I feel scared to let this part of myself come out in this time and space. And I just felt like the love of God like wash over me
mm,
and also and it like brought me to tears, and it's like I feel emotional thinking about it now, and I think about just the ways I get to encounter Jesus in the eyes of my friends who do not know him, and how deeply I feel the beauty of my neighborhood in fleeting moments. And I think in that, I just hope that people know there's something so much greater than being awesome at the conveyor belt of church. and and that like God loves us when we're not achieving. I think
mm,
that's been a huge revelation for me of there have been so many times in the last few years where I'm like I felt like I honestly had nothing to give. Like I was so
mm,
busy in with things that were non-negotiable in my life. Like I just did like the time I had being in full-time ministry, doing all these things for God, feeling really good about myself. The last few years, it's like I haven't been able to do that. I had other things that were really important. My full-time job is no longer vocational ministry. That
mm,
there's all these things, and I remember there have been months where I'm like, I'm not doing the things I'm supposed to be
mm,
doing as a good Christian or whatever. And and I think I've just been surprised at how God has met me in that space of like, it's just never been about that. It's
mm,
never been about that. And to encounter Jesus as truly secure and loving and present
mm,
and dependable and kind. I hope people experience that in this journey
mm,
that God doesn't need you to prove anything for him, and he is not insecure his work in the world.
yeah.
I think that's what I really
Mm,
hope.
mm.
What about you?
I mean, I think you're saying, I mean, I almost just want to end the podcast there, but I feel so much of feel so similar. And I mean, I think what I referenced Ash's book earlier is that I think the journey of that I've been on for the last, almost now, going on my 8th year is just God is just so much more wild than we often reduce him to be. I love you talking about God's agency that we so often we limit, I think, the complexity of his inner workings. We talk a lot about how do we be detectives of divinity? How do we
Yeah.
start to, like, from the moment that our feet hit the ground, realize that we're on sacred ground, constantly looking for God. Where are you working? Where you might surprise me? And I'm excavating that not only for myself, but I'm also trying to do that for those around me. I'm doing that in spiritual community. I'm trying to eventually earn the right to do that for my neighbors. And like you're saying, we're we all have our own stuff we're working through. That's what I love about Ash's book. She's emotional in her own way about encountering God and experiencing his love and grace for some of her own things that she's wrestling through. I recently had this being in a monastery, feeling the very similar way for the first time, sitting in silence for days on end and feeling, was I pulled back some of my false selves, God's presence come rushing in, giving me very similar messages, how performative and achievement mindset my faith journey has been. And I hope that we create communities where people that can happen, that they can wrestle through, and at moments it seems like the curtain gets peeled back, and whether it's them personally or their entire community get to experience God. And there's other ways that they it might be a journey of working harder, both in their neighborhood or in their own lives in certain seasons or in certain moments, asking God where he's at. But that we would foster environments where that's possible. And I want folks to leave behind the muscle memory and the experiences they've had, both good and bad, whether they've been fully integrated or they've only tasted it from the outside, to realize that that this short, brief moment in North American evangelical history is not all that there is. If it sounds like we're having to do, if we're pushing back on something, it's because I don't know if we can relearn until we've unlearned. And I don't think until we name some of our assumptions and our motives stepping into something that we can't begin to journey into the beautiful space that I think God has for us, where it's opening like a whole nother reality. I've got a friend, Mark Nelson, who talks a lot about imagining God as a house, and that he thinks, I realize that I've only sometimes experienced God, and I've only experienced certain rooms of God. Like he said, the same thing. Like if people come over to my house, often they might only get to see 1 or 2 rooms of my house, but there's this whole other part to it that they've never experienced. And in the same way, he goes, even though, he's much older than I am, he goes, I think there's so many rooms, so many doors of God that I haven't opened up. And I think for a lot of us, until we name that we've only been in one room, how can we possibly explore any other? And that's what I really want for people, is just to name, there actually is a door worth walking through. And I'm not going to let anyone else tell me that this is all that there is to God. And I'm going to walk through that door, and I want to be a part of a community that allows me to do that, and then maybe walk through the next one after that, and the next one after that, and spend the rest of my days saying, there is a wild, beautiful God who wants to know me, who's drawing near, and the ways that he's doing that, and the people that he's using, and the means that he's using to do that, I'll never get to the end of exploring just how crazy those are. And I won't ever be able to count them. Honestly, I'll just have to tell stories. That's my hope.
Yeah. I wonder too, maybe I think the final question we should go over is there any advice you would give to new leaders who are interested in walking out these ideas, and where should they start? Because I think what we're sharing, I hope sounds beautiful, but I also could see it sounding nebulous of what do I do to get into this? Because I do think some of it is wild and hard to quantify or even break down into it's not a formula. So it's not going to be here's step 1, here's step 10, and this is how you know you're on the right track. But I do think there's something integrative about spirituality that's wholehearted and engages your mind, your emotions, and your body. And I think once you're in it, you're going to feel it. But if you were to give advice on how do people get started, what would you say?
I think it's just mindset. I think my biggest advice would be view this as something God's wanting to do in you more than what he's trying to do through you, first and foremost. And so I'm going to reorient my life around my neighborhood first and foremost. I'm going to experience God in ways that I never have before he does anything through me. If I have the ability to participate in a microchurch community or get one started, that I would respect the journeys of the other people around. I would let them tell their stories. I would go slow and not feel rushed to we need to achieve X, Y, or Z by this timeline, or our group needs to look exactly like this in 6 months, or we've somehow failed. But just to go slow and to view it all as a learning experience, asking lots of questions, taking lots of deep breaths, and saying, God, what are you teaching me through this? What am I learning about you that I needed someone else, or I needed whether my neighbor or someone in my microchurch to teach me, rather than just think that my whole lens of faith is through numerical growth. And I think if you can just stop, there will probably be seasons, by the way, if you do this long enough, where you will grow numerically, or there will be lots of new people that are stepping in, or you'll have moments that there will be some things like, my goodness, like look at these new 10 people that are part of my faith community that weren't there 5 years ago. That's great. We're not, again, growth happens. People's lives will be transformed. Hopefully you'll get to baptize them and help them experience fullness of life in Jesus. But that you first and foremost would say, let's work about the inputs. Let's just worry about faithfulness. Let's worry about my own journey that I'm in rather than just what I can achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess the only thing I would add to that is like seek out and embrace the windy paths. Like I think I loved when we were both reading that book by Ash, that I think something you texted me was like, I have no idea where this is going. And I just like remember feeling that like as I was like listening to it as well, just like, yeah, like every chapter I'm like, wait, what? Like, and it like she's such a good writer too, so I think that helps. But as I was like listening to that book, I was like, yeah, like I have no idea where she's going. I think she has no idea really where she's going, and then where she ends up, I'm like, whoa, what? Like, yeah. And I know that like her personal journey is probably not done too, but I think
nor will it ever be.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's living this out. A lot of it feels like that, and I think maybe if you've come from some similar backgrounds to us, that can feel very scary and anxiety inducing because it's not clean cut and it's like feels like a spiritual roller coaster and confusing. And I think we all have an inclination of like wanting it to be like, oh, this is the story, this is the story, this is the story, and like tie a bow on it. But I think you just have to embrace like, no, I have no idea where this is going, but that doesn't mean God's not working. So how can I just be open to the presence of Jesus and what he wants to do, and know the story will never be finished, and I can just be along for the ride and be curious and have a little bit of fun when I'm confused, and that's okay. Like I think I just wanted to name that of like, it's gonna feel kind of confusing, and like that you're not doing it wrong. But stay curious and stay open to that, and know that's like that's a part of it.
Yeah, embrace the mess.
Yep. Well, I think, do you have any final thoughts you want to land on before we kind of wrap this up?
I think that's a perfect final word for us.
Yeah, embrace the mess, the messy middle. It's going to be okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We are excited to keep working on this podcast and sharing it with you as we walk through the realities of following God in the everyday life. So if you want to check out more about the Renaissance Network, whether you want to join a microchurch or you want to hop into a future cohort, you are absolutely welcome. Head to wearerenaissance.org. I know that we are like thinking about launching a new cohort in the fall, so want to plug that. But without further ado, bye.